Welcome everyone, bon appétit. Welcome to our first noontime conversation for this semester. My name is Maria de Jesus and I'm an SIS faculty member along with the person I'm about to present, as well as taken on a new role that started this semester as Associate Director for Teaching and Learning at CTRL. I'll take just one opportunity very quickly to mention our next noontime conversation, which is taking place. You have these flyers on your table, October 4th, same time, 12 to 1:30, Mary Graydon Center, and it is entitled Racial Literacy in the Wake of Charlottesville, Virginia. The other thing that we have on your tables are these instructional technology workshops, and you can find more information there and seek me or email ctrl@american.edu for more information. And finally, your fall 2017 courses. It's not too late to go green. If that's something that you're interested in, please feel free to talk to me as well about that. Today, without further ado, I'd like to present to you Amanda Taylor, who is a faculty member as well at SIS in the Intercultural and International Communication program, as well as a fellow at CTRL who specifically supports pedagogical strategies and thinking for all our faculty in terms of faculty development. So thank you so much, Amanda. She'll be presenting some ideas, and of course she can go on for days on this topic of culturally sustaining classrooms, but the idea is she'll set us up, and we're hoping to have a lot of critical engagement with all of you in the room. So without further ado, Amanda.
Thanks. Thanks, Maria. You know I have friends in the room when it starts with a lot of clapping. Thank you so much. Welcome. I'm a walker-arounder, sorry. So I'm Amanda Taylor. Good to see some faces in the room that I know, and I'm really, really glad for some new folks that we'll have a chance to meet today. Thanks for taking the time during what I'm sure all of you are also feeling has been an extraordinarily busy beginning to the semester, to sort of be together in community over some good food. Thanks to Essence and to Anna and to Sarah and all the CTRL folks for all the work that you've done to really put together a great opportunity here for us to be together. So I want to start off just kind of opening this broad conversation around culturally sustaining pedagogy by talking a little bit about how I stumbled into it myself. I'm in SIS, as Maria said, but I really came to this as a teacher. So I started out my career as a high school teacher, and I started out as your archetypal white teacher in an urban public high school in California where none of the students looked like me. And I had, I think, what was an extraordinarily important experience for myself in figuring out how I was cultured to think about the way the world worked, the way schooling should work, the way teaching and learning should work, and really stumbled and interrupted my opportunity for working effectively with my students. So I think I had my rose-colored glasses on about how I could come in there like Michelle Pfeiffer in Dangerous Minds, right, and save all of these young people. And when I started to really think about what I was doing, I started recognizing the way that I was approaching my work from a deficit model. I was centering my experience as one that was normal and that was desirable and that was worth wanting, instead of really learning how my students themselves had incredible funds of knowledge, resources, opportunities, ways of knowing about the world that were assets upon which we could collectively build to engage in a really dynamic learning space. But it took that encounter for me to really start to understand how my own life, my own accumulation of experiences based on all of my identities, based on my own educational experience, sort of shaped all of these assumptions I had about what I was doing there, and what I should be doing in there, and who my students were, and what they should be doing and how we should be doing it together. So what I'm kind of hoping to open today is some reflection on what this idea is. How might we approach our own classrooms? And I'm looking around and seeing both faculty and staff out here. So I think when I'm saying classrooms here, but I think we should think about encounters with students on campus. broadly, whether that's in your office, if you're a staff member, or if that's in your actual classroom, if you're a faculty member, but how we can really think about the ways that culture and, importantly, power shape how we teach and how we learn, and that interaction between ourselves and our students in ways that are more conscious of all of our intersecting social identities. So that's kind of our goal here today from my perspective. So spoiler alert, we are not going to solve this today, nor am I going to give you a nice prescription that you can write down and take back and apply to all of your interactions in a way that will make it all go away and make these what can feel like difficult conversations or challenging encounters easy. What I'm hoping we'll do is together sort of work on a framework for how we might think about engaging in this work, how we might reflect intentionally and continually on our practice. And again, I'm using this word practice because this is not about being perfect. It's about continually ongoing, in an ongoing way, and in community, really thinking through how the assumptions that we're bringing to our own work with students and the way their experience of the world and their sets of assumptions are shaping how they encounter our interactions and our curriculum. So that's what you're going to get. But there are some resources, I promise, and some takeaways for those of you that are really interested in those. There are some of those as well that we'll get to at the end. Okay? So here's a couple of just organizing questions. What I'm hoping we'll sort of get through, and the way that I've structured this is kind of a set of ideas and then an open conversation, another set of ideas and an open conversation, another set of ideas and an open conversation. We'll see how much we get through. Like a good pedagogue, I've planned way too much for this amount of time. So we'll see what we get to. But what I hope we talk about are kind of these questions. Why do culturally sustaining classrooms matter? Why should we care about this kind of stuff, right? And then second, what might it look like to start to frame our teaching or our engagement with students inside or outside the classroom in a culturally sustaining way? And specifically, we'll look at two dimensions of that, kind of considering identities, the way that we've talked about, and then also considering how we sort of explicitly use pedagogy and practice. And again, this practice can be everything, including our approach to students, the way that we ask them to participate. This could be in the classroom, this could be in our conversations with students in our office if we're staff, but it's sort of what we do and how we do it, okay, and how those things are connected to who we are and who our students are and our interactions together, okay? So just to start us off, I want to open a broad question that I want you to sort of discuss with folks at your table after you, of course, introduce yourself if you haven't done that already. What the heck is a culturally sustaining classroom? What do you think that might be? If you have no idea, that's all right too. But take a minute to introduce yourselves and also just to suggest what comes to your mind when you hear this phrase. Okay, so take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to do that together. Okay, so let's start coming back together here. We'll have a couple other chances, obviously, to dive more into what sound like some really meaty conversations you've already gotten into. But I wonder if I can ask just a couple of tables or representatives from tables to share what your initial impressions were, any struggles you're having around this concept. Oh, thanks. Okay, let's start with Andrea, and then we'll go to Betsy.
So we actually wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, please do.
Our table wanted to ask you a question, what the difference is between a culturally sustaining and a culturally sensitive classroom.
Yeah, good. That's a good question. What's the difference between culturally sustaining and culturally sensitive? You may have heard phrases culturally responsive also. So there's lots of frameworks, and this one is sort of particular. So thank you for pulling that up. Betsy?
I was very perplexed by this term.
Yeah.
So I listened. And we had a really, I think, productive conversation, and I'm going to pass it on. Who best understood the term, at least as I understand it.
Okay, please. Can you tell me your name?
My name is Shelley Sandoval. I'm faculty at School of Professional Extended Studies, and I took one of her workshops.
Oh, good. So have I.
That's irrelevant.
So I was not. So I was just saying two parts of it is one, it could be based upon a constructivist type of pedagogy, which means that the educator is a facilitator instead of just pouring knowledge into an empty vessel that is the student. They are facilitating their learning in their lifelong span of educational goals. And so in that sense, as a facilitator myself, I have curriculum and I have assignments and I have exams and ways to approach my teaching. But at the same time, I need to be flexible and aware of who my students are and allow them a voice in how their semester goes. And that may be difficult. I've taught both 180 student classrooms and now 20 student classrooms. So, and we talked about this in a workshop, but it's difficult depending on the size, the subject you're teaching, and the type of students. And then so that's culturally classroom. And then the sustaining part, another colleague of mine mentioned how it should be about being able to continue this on in the long term. So what is a classroom, deconstructing the notion, and then allowing for a holistic approach to education itself. And then lastly, if cultural also includes multiculturalism, also includes diversity and inclusion, then at the same time, how are we as educators reflecting our students, both physically, mentally, educationally, meaning why are all the educators one type of culture? Why are we not more culturally inclusive ourselves? So we are part of that classroom. Deconstructing the classroom reflects the mirror on ourselves as well.
Thank you. Helpful. Anyone else? Other thoughts? Different perspectives on this? Any hard scientists in the room? I'm a soft scientist, I'm a social scientist. Yes, you got a hand raised. How do you approach this idea of sustaining? We sometimes get some good other opinions. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alex Estos.
Hi,
I'm a new assistant professor in the chemistry department.
Great.
And one of the reasons I came here today is because during our new faculty orientation, we asked the question, what is culturally sustainable? And I think each person who answered gave a different answer.
Yeah.
Not to draw on, I think it is what my opinion is, just to create this constant feedback between student and teacher and see how is progress going into, are you learning, are you culturally sensitive to each one of your students, and are you getting feedback from them? And that this is going to be a constant struggle to solve the problem. There isn't going to be one solution to do this, but constantly having feedback with the students back and forth to try to solve and address this issue. What I think culturally sustaining is working to narrow the gap between student and teacher, I believe.
Right. So we're hearing again the centrality of the student-teacher relationship and making sure there's voice sort of on both sides, I think is one connection we're hearing here. Senem, and then we'll come over to this table.
I'm Senem, and I'm not a faculty member, but I'm a practitioner, right? So this is what I was thinking, bear with me. A culturally sustaining classroom might be a classroom where the faculty member from day one is aware of the fact that there are a lot of different people in that class, right? Differences not only in terms of teaching or learning styles, but you know, the belief system and everything, right? There is no way that we can know everything about everybody. However, if the beginning point is to set the expectations that, hey, this is about tolerance, this is about introducing ideas, opening minds, bringing new perspectives, there is no judging, right? I think 50% of the job is done. The other thing is that feedback is important. We put a lot of focus on feedback, but as you all know, that you may be speaking with somebody who is very honest otherwise, but they will never give you their real opinion because you are a professor, you are a student, because of that, you know, power dynamic. So I wouldn't really focus too much on that feedback system and say, I know exactly what's going on with this student. So my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you. So how do we build these deep teacher-student relationships that acknowledge sort of domains of difference and the power inequalities that are built into not only our classrooms, but our systems, our world. So I'm hearing what is culturally sustainable in that context, and also why then would we engage in these practices? What's it for? Yeah. And I think table over here, and I don't know your names. If you could tell me your name, that'd be great.
So I'm Saul Newman. I'm an
Hi,
SPA. I'm not necessarily speaking on behalf of the
Sure.
table, but it's an issue that I raised. I don't know if everyone's responsibility for this. So I think there are two ways of interpreting the term culturally sustaining. One is sort of a negative and one is a positive, and I'm not sure which it is, which we want. So one way of looking at it is that a culturally sustaining classroom is needed because the classroom situation can be disempowering, right? The uneven power balance, the fact that the professor may come from one culture, students may identify with other cultures. So we need a culturally sustaining classroom whereby the professor is aware of cultural differences, uneven power relationships, and is respectful of that to create the most positive learning environment. The other way of interpreting, and I don't know what culturally sustaining means, I'm just thinking out loud, the other way of interpreting it is that it's the obligation of the professor in what they teach to sustain diverse cultures in the classroom. And the question that I have with that definition is, where does cultural sustaining end and content start? And where's the balance between the obligation to sustain cultures that different identities exist in the classroom and the ability to convey some sort of professional, so to speak, content? And I'm a little more unclear about that version of the issue.
Yeah, good. I think that's helpful. And I'm curious, which of those, Saul, you said one's a positive and one's a negative. Which do you, in your mind, which is which?
So I guess I shouldn't have said that.
It's okay. I'm curious. And if it doesn't fall that way after
So
talking
I
through it, that's
mean,
all right.
the first one I described, sorry, my voice is pretty loud. The first one I would describe as the negative, sort of compensating for the negative, sort of creating a condition that's sort of, creating a condition where everybody can learn and removing the negative of the uneven relationships and the lack of cultural diversity from the one person who's the professor. I looked at positive as being there's a positive obligation to sustain cultures, and there's also a positive obligation to teach content, and where do those two positives come into conflict with each other? So that's the way I looked at negative and positive. I don't know if you can do it any way you want.
Yeah. It's interesting. In my mind, those are both sort of positive, right? They're sort of moving us towards. But I understand what you're talking about.
What I mean by negative is there's a negative, a priori, there's a negative situation, and you need to make it sustaining and positive.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, let's take any more. Do we have one more? Yes, please. Would you say your name?
My name is Valentina Apida. I'm in the Department of Environmental Science. So
Great, good. Okay, good. We need some sustainability from some environmentalists. Yes, tell us.
So maybe this comes from the fact that English is my second language, and so I had to actually study grammar. So we use interchangeably sustaining and sustainable.
Yeah.
But actually, they're two different things. And so sustainable means that you reach a certain level and you maintain it. So it has more of an idea of you respecting the culture of the class. While sustaining, it has more of an active idea, and so it means building, I don't know if it means building the culture or the diversity of the class. And so I do find the term and the different synonyms of the term a little bit confusing, because I don't know exactly which aspect it reflects, or maybe both.
Thank you. That's helpful. And the sustaining, and we'll get to this sort of through the presentation, but the sustaining is the active domain, right? So we've got a lot of helpful expertise in this room around what this could be, and really helpful questions around what it may or may not be for us. So I want you to kind of hold these in the back of your mind, and then we're going to kind of back into them. All right, so we're going to approach this in a bit of a different way here. I want us to start by, any neuroscientists in the room? Anyone who's a little bit, we got a chemist in here. Okay. I want to back into this from a different perspective and start to think about the ways that we are sort of neurologically cultured, quote unquote, and how that might get us into this definition of what is culturally sustaining and why it might be important. Okay, so this is a fun little video just to get us warmed up, and I want to ask you to please play along. Okay, don't be embarrassed. Please play along. They're going to give you some tricks and ask you to exercise your brain, so enjoy. Okay. All right, despite the fact that it's clear that we all need to go back and practice our addition, what I want us to sort of think through is we started off saying, all right, what is culturally sustaining pedagogy or classrooms? And we played with what that might be. I want you to say, based on, and start to think about in your table, based on this video, how might we start to understand why culturally sustaining pedagogy is necessary? Okay? So knowing that we've got still some open questions around what exactly it is, we have a general sense. Why might this be something we should do, according to this video? Okay, so take 5 minutes at the table. Okay, so let's come back together. Some good meeting conversations going on. Let's come back together. Any specific thoughts that are maybe expanding on our conversation from before? Why, per this video, would it matter to do this sort of work, to engage our practice in this way? What were some of your conversations circling around? Even if you can't answer the question, what were you sort of wondering about?
I think it's a matter of different assumptions and different associations depending on identities and on cultural backgrounds. So this was about assumptions and associations. If you want to make that parallelism, this is what might happen when you have a class with different people coming from different backgrounds, having different identities, associating things in a different way.
So the way we fill in the context, the contexting process that was sort of framed
and
here.
I want to use, now that I have the microphone.
Please do, keep going. Everybody's got to have their plug. Plug it, Nuria.
To say that the cultural sustaining classroom, I also thought it was a way to describe kind of balance of power between different identities, being from the professor or the students, and I want to talk in plural because there might be identities in the most kind of diverse and plural way, in the search for a kind of harmonious evolution of the class. So the class evolves in a harmonious way. So that would be a parallelism with environment, and I'm sorry because I don't know anything about environmental sustainability, but I think that kind of idea of harmony should be brought into the conversation as well.
Interesting, yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm hearing you talk a bit about also this sort of contexting idea and a bit of priming that they were referencing, being cultured, right? What we're primed to see and notice or not notice is based on the accumulation of our experiences in some ways. So anybody in this, yes, please. And would you say your name?
Anu Mitra.
Thank you, and the microphone is coming right here.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Priming is almost an automatic response, right? Your past, your context is providing the schema, and then you're reacting to that. But I think, or wouldn't you say that some of what we teach or try to impart in classes to break some of that, so that you are more thoughtful, not this automatic response based on whatever it is, very discrepant or very diverse experiences, which is all great, but which may actually be a bottleneck to what, for some clarity of thinking in some cases.
That's helpful. So I'm hearing you also talk about moving from what Kahneman frames as fast thinking into maybe more slow thinking in some ways.
Because Kahneman, is well known for the heuristics and things that we all have, that we just operate with. But and we fall prey to some of that.
Of course.
And we need to be as academics or whoever is interacting needs to be aware of that.
Right.
But we need to sometimes go beyond that.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, Gihan.
Can
you take the mic if you don't mind?
Sorry.
Thank you.
I agree with that thought. My real worry with both the fast thinking and also it has lots of analogies to unconscious bias, right?
Yep.
Is by definition, it's unconscious or it's happening like that,
Yep.
you know, and I'm really concerned that there's no awareness raising that can change that. Right, you're still priming it, so how do we get past that?
How do we get past our priming? There's almost a paradox inherent in this, right?
Right.
Which is to suggest, even in trying to get past it, you're still operating from within the system, right? That you've been primed to notice. But there is this notion that we can and do move to slow thinking. So this is what we're talking about here. How and when do we move into this slow thinking, which asks us basically to rethink our initial, and what you're arguing is automatic, and I think that's right, but it has been cultured. Yeah, it's not that we were born with it. These are things that have been developed over time, but feel automatic because they're so normal to us. Yeah? Right. Exactly. Yes, please.
Isn't that why we want to make sure that our students are getting lots of new experience? I'm thinking about the two bank analogies.
Right.
And if you wanted to be a person who thinks about riverbanks, you could go spend a lot of time by riverbanks and only do online banking. You know what I mean? So that when people said, if someone's going to, by getting different experiences and different exposures, you can in some way change your automatic thinking, potentially.
Right.
Because at least they were arguing that the reason that we think banking with money is because we go to banks more often than riverbanks. But in a lot of places in the world, they probably go to a lot more riverbanks than banks.
There are possibilities to change the context within which we may make different interpretations, right? Yes.
So I would just play off that. I found that Lisa left, but I think she just left. I found the actual whole video kind of ironic in and of itself because I'm neurotic about certain things. One of the things I'm really into is math tables. So when I saw 26 times 19, I fast thought the answer right away. And I'm biblically literate, so when I saw the Moses thing, I immediately jumped and said, Noah, what are they talking about? So I think that was very instructive, because here he in a sense the video in a sense was culturally insensitive to me. My immediate reaction was, you're assuming that everybody in this room is going to fast think one way, I'm fast thinking a different way, and I was particularly taken aback, which gets to your point about sort of, you can culturally change by living, and if you live in my world, math tables and Moses are a really big
Math
thing.
tables and Moses. I feel like that's the title of the next Noontime conversation. Math tables and Moses are everything. I love it. But I think, so here's a question. You're right? What are we primed and what assumptions do we build in? I think we can take a instruction from this. What assumptions are built into our understandings, right, of what is shared sets of cultural information? And what is going to be marginal or discrepant kinds of contexts, right? Thank you. Daniel.
I have two thoughts on, how do we actually put this in practice? How can we make it work?
Yeah.
First one is it's just pretty trivial, but I've actually started to do it in my own teaching, and I've about 3 years ago started to also suggest it to the students, which is fortunately, the students are not able to yet read our minds, which I think 20 years, that's probably where they are. So, that gives me a lot of control over how I frame conversations in the classroom. As soon as I have given myself the chance to reflect on my first response.
Right.
Right? So, student I think is Muslim raises her hand, and bang, my mind goes like, oh, now we gotta be extra careful, and then, oh, what did just happen? And before I verbalize that, I can actually try to rein it in. I think even more powerful, but certainly still a luxury, and I've been very privileged to enjoy that luxury, is to team teach and to co-teach and to actually sit down and debrief with your co-instructor. And as I did a week ago with my co-instructor, and we basically said, so share all the preconceptions you have about every single student, and then let's unpack them. And I think we had a great conversation, and including about a student who's probably very good with Moses. But you know, that would require that we actually have that dynamic in the classroom,
Right.
where we had at least another person to also observe the dynamic and provide feedback that's not evaluatory but more formative.
Right, I think that's helpful. So I hear you, Daniel, if this is fair, suggesting a couple of things. One is that specifically, I'm assuming when you say you look at a Muslim student, you're saying, you are not Muslim yourself. Is that a fair? Okay, so you're suggesting that when you encounter what you perceive to be difference, right, in your frame, you have a series of sort of pre-primed associations that are kind of flowing out of that.
It's a cascade.
Right, the cascade of cognitive associations. So whatever that line of difference may be, it's our perception also of difference, right? But you're suggesting, I think, as a strategy, one is how do we figure out how to recognize that and stop ourselves before we then use all of those primed ideas to inform how we respond to students who we perceive to be different before we even know their story, let's say, right? Or even when we do. Is that fair? Yes.
Yeah, not even perceived to be different, but I think, you know, and that's where the constructivist argument comes in.
Right.
We make a decision,
That's
a
right.
subconscious decision of difference.
Right.
We decide that
Yes.
someone's different.
That's
We
right.
decide otherwise, right? I make my perception of the Muslimness salient to me.
Right.
But I can also make a decision not to make it salient before I even question whether the person is Muslim. But even if I knew it, I can still make a decision to not care about it because most likely it doesn't actually matter in the context. So to become aware of one's choices of what is saying that.
Right, and how do we do that in a context in which those choices are so reflexive, right, and so sort of instantaneous? I think you're right. We do have the capacity to move, we know, to slow thinking, which is what you're arguing. Slowing ourselves down, recognizing we have a set of associations, right, backing away from them, and then figuring out how we want to engage with them. But it is quick, is what we're hearing here. That happens really fast. So one thing you suggested here is working in teams. And I actually think that is the biggest takeaway from all of this. None of us, somebody said this earlier, none of us can ever have the full perspective. We're all of our truths are partial, right? All of our experiences are partial, no matter who we are, right? So how do we do this in community? And I think that is, if there's one takeaway from this, we have got to do this together. No matter what you do, no matter where you sit, anytime you encounter what you perceive to be difference and you're trying to figure out how to make sense of it, working in collaboration, especially with folks who are not like you, however you define that, right, is vital to moving us into understanding our fast thinking and into slow. Salvador.
I appreciate where the conversation is going.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned the word difference just now, because I think I'm uncomfortable when we talk about diversity, because for me, white people are a new breed. Like, in the world in which I work with Latinos and other students of color, I work with a lot of LGBT identified and queer students. And so for me, this notion of diversity, if it's devoid of power, is problematic.
That's right.
So, you know, some of us, when we teach, and when we have audiences that belong to the majority, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of power, we have to do that work, not with another person, but ourselves, on the spot in the classroom, right? And we have to think, because when we're talking at the table, we have to think about this person brings in already stereotyped notions of me that I have to counter, cannot get upset, and have to educate the person, which is 3 jobs at once, and then teach the class, right? So to me, part of what's important is to think beyond what I or you individually need to do, because I think it individualizes something that's structural.
That's right.
I think it's important that you and I think about what we need to do, but we also need to think structurally. So I was saying in the table that I teach a lot of classes on Latinos, and every semester that I teach a course, I have one white student who comes to me individually and says, you know, Professor, I want to make sure I don't say the wrong things. And this year, in a complex problems class, and a student said, I have never been in a classroom where I am the numerical minority. And I had to say to her, that's great, stay with that feeling.
Right.
Like, just give me a couple of weeks, stay there. This is important because I want you to think, what does this mean in every other class, and what will it mean in the next 4 years of your education, and then in the world, right? And so I think we have to think about that notion of power when we talk about diversity, because otherwise it's not difference, otherwise it's not about hierarchies, otherwise it's just cultural in the sort of most banal, basic, and almost obscene sense, right?
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. And I think where you're pushing us, helpfully, to go are towards what are two of the sort of key features of this frame of culturally sustaining pedagogy. There are multiple frames: culturally sensitive, culturally responsive. Even the notion of inclusivity, personally, I feel I have a hard time with it, because inclusive into what? To me, that ignores the structural a little bit. Unless we're talking about transformations of institutions, I think that can be limiting as well. At the same time, the individual is the structural, right? So the interpersonal is the institution. We're not separate entities. But difference only takes on meaning in context, right? How we're understanding difference is against the backdrop of what's seen as normal. And so when we move to thinking about culturally responsive pedagogy, what it assumes is a couple of sort of baseline things that we've talked about, right? Who we are, culture and identity. We could spend another 3 noontime conversations on that, but in its complex form, okay? Shape our pedagogy and teaching practice. Similarly, shape the way our students learn and experience our classrooms. But importantly, the key feature of this, and this gets to Saul's point a little bit, I think, in the beginning, schools themselves are representations of cultural formations, which are usually dominant white Western ones. Okay, that's sort of an assumption built into this pedagogy. That's the structural piece. That's why what you said, it's abnormal for students to have a teacher of color. We've all talked, that is only abnormal in the context of an institution that has centered whiteness and white instructors as normal. So slow thinking kicks in when all of a sudden I have a teacher who is not in my normal. All right? My fast thinking of continually to reinforce the notion that white instructors are normal, let's say, or certain practices or policies in the classroom are normal. That's where this gets institutionalized, okay? And that's where difference starts to take up meaning and consequence for students, right? So what this frame of culturally sustaining pedagogy and classrooms broadly suggests is that schools themselves, both consciously and unconsciously, both, okay, reproduce and reinforce dominant cultural practices and identities, all right? What those dominant practices and identities are, again, those are going to be contextual, okay? But what we've heard here, we know this at AU, right, is that our students are now actively suggesting they're feeling this, yeah? Our colleagues, I'm highlighting Jordana, who's a colleague of ours in SIS, are talking about education as a crucial site for social reproduction, and thus it cannot but be complicit in the act of domination. The idea that schools as institutions and AU as a specific institution are in fact reproducing dominant ideologies, epistemologies, okay, ways of experiencing the world, ways of knowing that is the institutionalized domain, even if transformation and resistance sort of can happen in individual and interpersonal contexts, that the structure of this space is one in which we are reinforcing, valuing, giving good grades to, right, centering, celebrating what has been perceived as normal and successful ways of doing things, okay? So Jordana, I really like her article, which she wrote in the Eagle, if you haven't read it, and it's essentially about decolonizing the curriculum. So how do we move also from the interpersonal to the institutional and rethinking how we approach the work we're doing here? And I think, she doesn't say this, but I'd say this, she may agree, that the curriculum is bigger than just what we teach in our classes, okay? We have the explicit curriculum, which are our classes, their focus, the readings that we have, those are all important domains. But also we have what Giroux and others would call the hidden curriculum. Okay, the hidden curriculum being, what are we teaching about the world, about the good life, about what success looks like, what a good student looks like, a good teacher looks like, through our everyday practices. Who gets awards on campus could be understood in this way as a domain of the hidden curriculum. Who do we celebrate as successful graduates of this program? What kinds of policies do we center as best practices? And what kinds of ways of knowing and thinking do those reflect? When we talk about research, what approaches to research are seen as most policy relevant, all right? Most fundable. And how can we start to really, at every level, ask questions about the ways that those sometimes center and reinforce white and Western ways of knowing? So I just had to put this up there because I heard this on my way in today. Did anybody else hear this morning on the radio? Did you hear this? Do you remember what it was about? Do you mind sharing?
Oh, I was fascinated because if you've been following like the regional news the past few years, Georgetown University has publicly acknowledged that some 150, 200 years ago, some of the Jesuit priests had sold some of the enslaved Africans that were working on Georgetown's campus. And in recent years, in order to attempt to recompensate their descendants for this wrong, they have sought they sought to identify who the descendants are of these enslaved Africans and name them as legacies to receive all the rights and privileges of a legacy who would attend Georgetown University. And so according to NPR this morning, there's 3 students that are freshmen at Georgetown this year who are descendants of these enslaved Africans. And this woman is not an 18-year-old freshman. And that's the other remarkable part of her story. But yeah, thrilling story, an amazing way to start my morning this morning.
Yeah. I would encourage you actually to listen to this if you can. But the reason she's 63, amazing, and it's an awesome interview, right? But what I want us to think about here is the way that we're now really starting to see in obvious ways, and institutions are starting to actually name the way that our legacy was built on the backs of many non-dominant communities, in this case African Americans, but we can go on and on. It's not just about African Americans per se, right? There's all kinds of historically marginalized communities whose work and research and ideas and ways of knowing in the world are those upon which our institutions have been built. So it's kind of built into the architecture of what we do, both physically and the sort of cultural architecture that shapes our understanding of what's normal and what's regular and what's valuable in these spaces. Marianne?
And I think I've been following this story really closely, and I think what's so incredible about what they've done is they've figured out how the structure piece plays in. Mm-hmm. That if you were a former African slave, you are less likely to have gone to a school like Georgetown and get a legacy to something like this. So they're actually, they're addressing the structural problem, not because I've talked to people like, well, why aren't they giving scholarships instead? That's more needed. And what their professors did incredible research on this, and they actually found that for them, the issue is, and it's very university specific, it's the structural piece, and it's the history that this creates. And so it's not a problem with this 63-year-old woman, it's a problem with the structure that has happened over the last couple.
That's right. And again, as we think about institutional architecture, what I like about this is it plays on that idea of being built. This is sort of physical spaces being built, but we're talking about these ideological spaces in which we operate that are so deeply cultured, and deeply built on inequalities, right? Not just about culture, but again about power inequalities. So this notion of culturally sustaining pedagogy, and I want to suggest, I'll give you at the end a couple of resources so you can really dig in more. But it comes from a linguist, actually, Django Paris, who is at UCLA, and Sami Alim, also a colleague of his. And they specifically have used this frame, which builds on other frames like culturally sensitive and culturally responsive. And they're attempting to push beyond those ideas. Okay? What they're suggesting is that just being sensitive, right, to cultural differences in how we might learn in our students, for example, often decenters the teacher, or recenters, I should say, the teacher as the expert, as the cultural normative, okay? So that it still positions the students as other sometimes. And there's a deficit model built in there. They're missing something that I need to be sensitive to, and thus I must fill it up with what I, as teacher, who often come from dominant perspectives, think you should know. Okay, so that's where this is kind of building on that. They say they're lovingly critiquing it, actually, because they all work together. And again, culturally responsive, suggesting that we sort of just respond to ways of knowing and learning that might be different for students, continues to also ignore in some ways the institutional. So what they're suggesting is this. Centrally, culturally sustaining pedagogy exists wherever education sustains the lifeways of communities who have been and continue to be damaged and erased through schooling. So it's explicitly countering this erasure that we're hearing from our students and our colleagues and our partner institutions all around us that have been built into how we come to experience school, all of us. And what this is attempting to do is center that. Instead of erasing that history, center it, name it, and work from there. Okay, and counter that erasure. And what they say in terms of framing that they're trying to do here is it seeks to perpetuate and foster, to sustain. Now this goes to sustaining and sustain, our colleague left, but to sustain linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism as part of schooling for positive social transformation and revitalization. Culturally sustaining pedagogy positions dynamic cultural dexterity as a necessary goal and the outcome of learning as additive rather than subtractive. I'm not taking away problematic cultural practices that you have that we need to erase in order for you to be successful. If you are from a non-dominant community, whatever that might be in all of those intersectional ways that we can understand that. But in fact, in a culturally pluralistic, globalizing world, I'm centering that as an asset. And I'm suggesting that my job as educator here is to sustain the funds of knowledge, ways of knowing, and all of the resources that are in and sit in and are transformed within cultural communities, and put those then in conversation with dominant cultural practices. Okay? Again, we're framing critically enriching strengths. We're not replacing deficits. This is why I started with this idea of deficit thinking, that sort of, I know, deeply frame my own initial engagements into teaching. What's missing here, and how do I fill it? I think that's going to this banking notion that our colleague here talked about. We sometimes want to fill our students with the things that they're missing. But how do we reframe and start to think about what do they bring? And how do we know? How do we make sure we know our students well enough to know what they bring? How do we know ourselves well enough to know what we bring and what we don't, where our blind spots are, such that we can hold up, sustain, and value ways of knowing that are going to be historically marginalized and erased in institutions. At the same time, recognizing that we've got to put these in conversation with dominant language, literacy, and cultural practices. Right? We live in a world in which students, all of us, must be literate in multiple sort of forms of language, broadly understood, different ways of being in the world. If we want an SIS, let's say, our students to go and do international development, right, Daniel?
We're actually working on convincing them not to do that.
No, okay, right. So we're decolonizing international development, right? That's our next Noontime conversation. We got it too, right? But right, how do we? There are certain things that our non-dominant students are going to bring to the classroom that are actually should be the center of the conversation instead of the margin. At the same time, if you want to go work at USAID, you're going to need to know how to speak and engage in a language, what Lisa Delpit would call the culture of power. Okay? And that we have to sort of hold both of these together in conversation. And that's the purpose of this frame of pedagogy. Okay, so I told you, I promised we would not solve any of this today. But it's really about opening a framework. And I want to leave us here with sort of two ways of thinking. I like to call and think about this work as a messy struggle. All right, it's not ever clear. It's something where we're often going to end up with sauce on our face. Okay, but it's a practice. Again, this is something that we have to continually do, and we have to actively do it in order to move from those fast thinking moments into slow thinking moments. When do we intentionally put ourselves in spaces in which we bump into cultural information that doesn't fit in our brains? How do we do that as practitioners, as pedagogues, right? Teaching is not a technical task in this framework. Teaching is a way, it's a framework, it's a way of living, I think, actually. And how do we practice it in an ongoing way such that we start to develop skills when we can start to notice ourselves fast thinking and move more strategically, continually into slow thinking and questioning what we have come to believe as normal. So I'm going to leave it there and turn to you all. We have 5 more minutes. And I know CTRL wants me to do a evaluation at the end, which I want to make sure we have. So let me just ask you all to kind of turn to each other and take at least 3 minutes to say, what works for you about this? Is there stuff that resonates? Or what doesn't? Where are your struggles? You could also think about, have you tried this or seen these kinds of things in your own practice? Or those of your colleagues? What have been the outcomes? Where have been the failures? Where's the spaghetti sauce on the face moments? But just maybe before you go to the, so what Maria's passing out here are some resources. I pulled together a bunch of links from lots of universities that are engaging in this work. And I've given also little blurbs as to what is in those links. For those of us who don't have a lot of time, I tried to do a little annotated bibliography for you so you know where to go. And also some readings that you can sort of lean on from here. But let me just ask, take a couple of minutes before you dig too much into those and talk with each other. Is this working for you? Have you tried it? Have you failed at it? Where are your struggles? And what might you do moving forward? Okay, so let's do 2 minutes of that and then we'll turn to the evaluation. Let me just leave you with this. Please keep having these conversations. That's the end of it. That's the end of it. We've got to talk to each other. We've got to do this in community. That's what practice is. We've got to be a community of practice. So please, across faculty and staff, across schools, this is how we've got to do this work. So thank you for taking this time. Thank you for being here. I've learned a ton. I appreciate all of my supporters in the audience.